Typically, when you start speaking, they shut up.
Okay, so I did my refutation topic about the foreign aid and how it's not effectively helping and is instead preventing the development of many sub-Saharan African countries. So my counterclaim is going to be that sub-Saharan Africa has been making some developments due to foreign aid assistance. The 3 points that my opponent made was that aid is not geared toward long-term development and sustainable growth of the countries receiving assistance. Second, that foreign aid cannot be effective in countries with weak governance. And third, countries can become dependent on foreign aid. So for the first one, that aid is not geared toward long-term development and sustainable growth of the countries receiving assistance. The first part of her point she made, for the first part of this claim, she expressed that aid from governments and big institutions is not helping to improve countries economically, and I have 2 responses to this. The first is that the example used in the end of the quote from Dembisa Moyo, author of the Wall Street Journal, states that more than 50% of the population in Africa, which is over 350 million people, live on less than $1 a day, a figure that has nearly doubled in 2 decades. And this actually contradicts the main claim that foreign aid is actually preventing the development of sub-Saharan Africa. And for my second response, according to Jane Harrigan, author of the Journal of Contemporary African Studies, in the first place, much aid, such as humanitarian relief, aid and other consumption forms of aid are not intended to increase economic growth. Likewise, we might also argue that the recent focus on social welfare expenditure and governance in aid programs is not primarily intended to boost growth, at least not in the short term and medium term. And this quote is stating that most of the aid provided to sub-Saharan Africa is not even actually meant to help the long-term development. And the second part of her claim, she states that the quantity of aid is valued over the quality. First, my 2 responses are, first, she gave no examples in the speech. Second, China's aid has had a significant impact on Africa over the last decade. According to Ali Zafar, author of Oxford University Press, the signs of China's economic expansion are becoming increasingly manifest in sub-Saharan Africa. Over the last decade, China has built a network of trade and investment links with close to 50 African countries. Chinese companies are mining oil in Angola and Sudan, building roads in Ethiopia, working with the electricity sector in Kenya, building infrastructure including dams, ports, and roads, and helping to renovate government offices and other buildings. And if you ask me, that sounds like a lot of quality going into just one country going out of their way to help the sub-Saharan area. For the second claim, she states that foreign aid cannot be effective in countries with weak governance. And for her first part of the claim, I have 2 responses. The claim was that it was stated that foreign aid contributes to economic growth in areas consisting of a good policy environment, and many underdeveloped countries do not have that type of environment. My 2 responses are, the first is from Collier and Gunning, authors for the American Economic Association. They state that econometric work does not find that aid has had a significant effect on policy, which is really contradicting to the end of the quote, which states that areas with poor policies cannot be effective to economic growth. And the second response I have is Nicholas Charon of the Wiley Online Library. He claims that there are numerous scholars who argue that, in fact, ODA, which is foreign aid, has had a positive impact on governance and indeed contributes to reducing corruption. For the second part of the claim, she states that foreign aid can be kept in the hands of the political elite. I have 3 responses to both the examples she used. First is that she failed to mention that they were caught and well punished. According to the BBC News article about the situation, Mr. Maluzi was charged along with his former personal assistant, Linus Whiskey, and they were both forced to surrender their passports to even receive a bail. The second is there was relatively small amounts that were stolen in comparison to how much they've received. So according to the World Bank Group, $771,390,000 was donated to Malawi the year one of the articles being published, and a political elite only stole 11 million of that, which is a really small fraction. Also, according to the World Bank Group, 157,610,000 was donated to Congo the year of the second example, in which a political elite stole 5 billion over a course of 30 years, which is also a really small fraction. And my third response is that it was also pretty irrelevant to the main claim due to the large amounts of money being essentially useless to the development anyways, because she basically states that there's no use for the money and it's not helping anyways. For the third claim, she states that countries can become dependent on foreign aid. For the first part, she says that foreign aid does not encourage economic innovation. I have 2 responses to this as well. This example states that the U.S. provides food to foreign countries and therefore puts local farmers out of business. This example is irrelevant to the supporting claim that countries can become dependent on foreign aid because it is clear that the farmers would actually do well without the interruption of the foreign aid. Also, that the supporting claim itself is also insignificant to the main claim because foreign countries would not become dependent on something that is supposedly harming them in the long run. And in conclusion, foreign aid has had a positive impact on the development of sub-Saharan Africa, and many of the examples used in this claim of fact speech are insignificant to the main claim. Thank you.
All right, well, you start off pretty well labeling the claim and the secondary claims. That's fine. But once we get to those points, you've got so many supporting points that you're responding to that it got a little bit confusing in trying to keep track of the numbers. I think it would be easier if we were listening to the debate immediately before and we had all of the notes that we had taken on the previous speech right in front of us. As it was, I thought that you sometimes basically repeated the claim twice, and the first time you repeated it sounds like it's your claim, and then the second time you presented it's like a separate signpost, and so it got a little bit confusing at times. Even though I could tell that you were trying to follow the directions that I gave you, I think it still ended up a little bit uncertain. Your argument on the first point that says that this issue about how much the value, what people live on in Africa has doubled in the last 30 years to $1 a day, and you say, well, that contradicts their position. I don't understand why. There's no explanation of that. You make an inference here that is not very clear on that particular point. I think your second argument there is a little bit more effective, and that is that most of this aid is not really sent as developmental aid. It's sent as humanitarian aid, and it's not really designed to have these long-term impacts that are being talked about. I think it might be helpful if you pointed out how frequently there are crises in Africa that require that kind of intervention, so that we could see that that's really the pattern of aid that's being given there, and it's not just developmental aid. I think your second argument suggests that there is aid that is being provided there, and it's not necessarily coming from international groups. It appears that China's doing pretty well in making inroads here and building some economic infrastructure for these countries, especially, and it's not motivated by altruism, it's motivated by their own interests as well. But if those things go together, that seems perfectly reasonable, and it seems like you've got at least some evidence that indicates that that's the case there. The argument about where weak governments are in place, that the policies can't really work, you basically say it's not particularly relevant to the position that the advocate's talking about. To me, it seems like it's pretty relevant to the argument about the elites and who's actually getting the money. I think you try to diminish that argument to some degree, and I think that that's a reasonable point to suggest. But for instance, if they only copped $11 million out of the $771 million, then we ought to be able to see some results from the remaining $761 million or $60 million that got spent. Do you have any data that indicates that that it worked in those particular places, that it made a difference or provided something? I think the advocate's evidence on this point was pretty generic, and your answer to it is a little generic. Also, it's really talking about corruption. It doesn't really talk about any of the developmental issues on that point. And you get to the last point, and once again, your claim is that it seems like it's irrelevant and it's not clear. I understood their point. I didn't think it was well documented. It seemed like it just simply asked a question, but you basically asked a counter question, so I'm not sure that I have much to compare on those two particular points. All right, thank you.